Dem deutschen Volk eine neue Idee zu geben.
Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Nazi Germany in 1933. That same year, Dachau concentration camp, just outside Munich, received its first inmates. 1939 Nazi Germany, led by Hitler, moves in on Poland, surrounding Warsaw. The city is bombarded by heavy fire. The destruction is felt as German forces move in on densely populated areas. Terror is felt on the streets of Warsaw. Poland surrenders to Germany, forcing Great Britain and France to declare war on Germany. This is the official start of World War II. Over a 6-week period in 1940, Germany overruns Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. German forces push their way toward France. German bombers move aggressively toward Paris. Germany bombs Paris, causing chaos in the streets. Civilians run for safety, fearing for their lives. Paris falls to Nazi Germany on June 14, 1940. Great Britain also feels the destructive impact of the Luftwaffe bombings. Japan strikes Pearl Harbor in 1941, pulling the U.S. into the war. 1944, Allied forces are pushing west to east against Nazi Germany. This is where his story begins. Stopping the Nazi regime is in full force by 1945. The cruelty carried out at Hitler's command was beyond appalling. Concentration camps, or death camps as they came to be known, were filthy, overcrowded, and diseased. Many were starved and forced to do hard labor until death. Others were subjected to medical experiments, testing drugs, freezing prisoners, dropping them at high altitudes, just to see how much the human body could take before death occurred. Jews were rounded up, placed on prison trains headed to death camps. They were marched to a death chamber, stripped down, and gassed to death. This had to stop.
Francis Sidaway was my uncle, my mother's oldest brother. He was a belly gunner on a B-26 bomber. He was drafted in the Army Air Corps, trained, and then he was sent to England first and then on to France. He got to France after the Allied forces had taken France back from the Germans, and his base was in France.
B-26 Marauder was first in combat during the Battle of Midway in June of 1942, and had a reputation as a widowmaker. It was a very hot aircraft. Trying to land the plane at low speeds was asking to die, and many crewmen lost their lives before they finally figured out what exactly they had to do. But by the end of the war, the B-26 had one of the lowest loss rates of any aircraft in the American inventory. A very good aircraft.
Sidaway is stationed at an air base in France. He is trained as a belly gunner. He has one of the most dangerous jobs on the plane. Behind guns hanging from open doors, he is an easy target for the enemy. Francis was an excellent marksman long before he became a gunner on a B-26. He grew up in Utah, in the small town of Vernal, about 175 miles east of Salt Lake City. He loved nature and often was found fishing or hunting as a young man. After high school, he moved to Garfield, Utah to work in the refining business. There, he met his wife Eleonora, or Nora as she was called. They married in 1934. Francis is working in California when drafted into the Army Air Corps. With Francis off to fight in World War II, Nora and the family wait back home in Utah. Nora worked as a seamstress at Camp Kearns, a World War II Army base on 5,000 acres south of Salt Lake City. Air raids continue as forces close in on Germany from all sides. U.S. and Allied forces bomb Munich and Berlin, trying to force Germany to surrender. Hitler and the Nazi regime begin feeling pressure as Germany is surrounded. U.S. fighter planes fly out of France, headed to Munich. Francis Sidaway was on one of those missions.
Francis Sidaway was going on a bombing mission to Munich. It was getting right towards the end of the war. It was 1945. They didn't think at that time, from the explanations he gave me, is he didn't think they had very many missions left when they were assigned on that mission to Munich. They were going to bomb Munich. The Allied forces had started to move into Western Germany, and they were basically going to bomb Munich to clear the way for the Allied forces to move even further into Germany.
The crew of 6 U.S. airmen take off from Léon Air Force Base in France on a bombing mission to Munich when they are met by Luftwaffe forces.
Well, the Luftwaffe was a German Air Force, and Adolf Galland had been instrumental initially as a bomber pilot, dive bomber pilot, and finally rose to become the lieutenant general in charge of the German fighter forces, and he became a fighter ace with 104 kills.
On April 26, 1945. They were in enemy territory, not too far from their target designation when they were shot down.
Their plane is hit. Having only a few minutes, Francis manages to parachute from the plane, but not before his gear gets caught.
He saw the river that was pretty close to where he was going to land, and the weight of his uniform and his parachute equipment, he was afraid that he might land in it and drown. And of course, the military parachutes at that time were not very directionally adjustable, so he did the best he could to make sure he landed on solid ground, which ended up being in a tree. I think he had definite fears of getting captured and not knowing what would happen after he got captured. It was a very critical time at the war. The Germans were trying to get out of it the best way they could. They were being pushed back. They had lost a lot of ground, a lot of territory in their battles, and I'm sure he was pretty fearful of being captured and put in a prison camp.
Francis was alive, but on the ground in enemy territory.
Well, I'm sure there was German forces that were in those areas, because the Allied forces were moving from France up into Germany and into Munich.
The American troops are marching or advancing on Dachau. They shoot their way through 2 German convoys and just kept going because there was so much going on, and their mission was to get there, and so it was a jumbled up kind of a mess.
Down in enemy territory, Francis quickly hides his parachute and gun in a wooded area.
Well, just imagine being shot out of the sky and surviving that traumatic event, and then landing on the ground and being worried whether or not you're going to be captured by German soldiers or by civilians who were very angry for all the destruction and death that they experienced at the hands of Allied airmen.
There was German forces in the area, and of course they seen the aircraft come down, and they started looking for survivors, and they found him right after he had got rid of his gear and got it hidden and buried and hid his pistol. And that's when they picked him up. He was captured by the Germans. He was put on a train with other captured troops and Air Force people, and was headed into Germany on that train.
Francis is in the hands of the enemy, headed to Dachau concentration camp.
Some of his fellow troops back at the base where he came from were also pretty sure that he was killed, because they had got word that everybody on the aircraft had been killed, and they actually started rifling through his belongings and giving them away.
Francis is now officially missing in action. The family, back home in Utah, are notified. The only thing they can do is wait.
The family was quite shocked, and basically were just kind of holding their breath, waiting to see if when they got any more news. There was, the way things were at the time, news didn't travel that fast, so it was a waiting situation, and of course they were all praying that he was okay.
By the time Francis is captured, Allied forces are closing in on Germany from both sides. Francis is on a prison train headed to Dachau, a place known for torture and death.
Dachau was the first concentration camp that opened when Hitler came to power in 1933, and Dachau was notorious as a place where anybody who disagreed with the Third Reich was sent. It was their showpiece concentration camp, just outside of Munich. And thousands of people were in that camp that had been shipped from other concentration camps that had been overrun by advancing Russian and American British forces. I visited Dachau twice, and both occasions were very sobering. When you walk from Dachau, which is almost like a suburb of Munich, and go inside the walls of the compound, you see this grill that says Arbeit macht frei, work makes you free, one of the slogans of the Third Reich. It's as if the birds stop singing. You can feel the presence of death, and maybe 30,000 people died in that small area.
Before Francis arrives, the Nazi regime begin to move prisoners out of Dachau. 7,000 are forced on a 30-mile death march. With little food and water, many die on the journey. Those who fail to keep up are shot along the way.
The death march took place when the commandant of the camp decided to take approximately 7,000 prisoners with him and march south to the Tegernsee in order to take these folks to participate in what was being planned as the Nazis' last stand in an Alpine redoubt, it was known as. This march involved terrible atrocities, and in one grave site along the march, they found over 1,100 bodies. Many of them were shot, and if you could not keep up with the march, you were executed by the SS guards.
He was put on a train with other captured troops and Air Force people and was headed into Germany on that train when that train was overtaken by the Allied forces. And they were all released. Of course, they couldn't send them back at that time, so they had to go with those Allied forces on into Germany.
No longer a prisoner of the Germans, he goes with the Allied soldiers on their way to Dachau. Francis is alive and in the company of Allied soldiers, but the U.S. Air Corps and his family back home are unaware.
Nobody was really notified of what his situation was until after it was, officially confirmed that he was okay. News reports basically was all they had. That's basically all that everybody had at the time, and because communications at that time are a lot different than they are nowadays, it took quite a while to get that information out to people, and then they basically were stuck with what the news told them.
Dachau opened in 1933, just after the Nazis gained power. It had a reputation for torturing prisoners. The camp became known as the murder school for SS members, the Nazi Germany elite force. Dachau grew so large, they had to open auxiliary camps. Many had underground factories, using prisoners as slave labor in unbearable conditions. 67,000 prisoners are registered at Dachau when the Allied troops arrive. Francis witnessed firsthand the torture, death, and inhumane treatment carried out at Dachau.
He never described what it was like to be at Dachau to me. Most of the discussions that he had after he came back were with his father. And the only thing I think that was mentioned at that time was that he was there with them when they liberated Dachau. Of course, he had had the chance after they got him off the train to go back and get his handgun and pick up his personal belongings where he landed with the parachute. And so he wasn't as well armed as the other troops that he was with that were headed into Germany. So he was basically just a passenger with them when they got there and liberated Dachau.
After liberating Dachau, troops march into Munich, the headquarters of the Nazi Party. They find out Hitler has committed suicide. This is the beginning of the end of Nazi power. May 7, 1945, Germany surrenders to the Western Allies. Germany surrenders to the Soviets. World War II officially ends in Europe. September 1945, Japan signs the surrender documents, officially ending World War II. Francis has made it through some difficult situations. His plane is shot down over enemy territory, where he is forced to parachute out. He was captured by the enemy, placed on a prisoner of war train headed for one of the worst concentration camps in Germany. Rescued by Allied forces, he witnesses the liberation of Dachau. The war is coming to an end in Europe, and Francis is on his way home. Meanwhile, Francis's family has been waiting for a long time to find out if he is even alive.
I'm sure he probably expressed to them that he was very happy to be home and he was glad to be out of the surface, but most of his conversations he had about his emotions and his feelings at that time were really limited. Like a lot of World War II veterans didn't talk about what took place and what they saw and how they felt. The only real discussions he had was with his father, and the rest of it, like many of the others at the time, they just held it within.
Francis is back in Utah, reunited with his family and getting on with his life. But the U.S. Army Air Corps have a few things to wrap up with Francis.
He received a Purple Heart for being wounded in action in the American military.
I know that he received a Purple Heart, but I'm not quite sure of when it was given to him and how it was awarded to him. That was long before my time. I know that that Purple Heart still exists. It's hanging on the wall in my mother's house.
Francis received the Purple Heart on July 25, 1946, for wounds received in action against the enemy. He also received a Certificate of Appreciation for his sacrifice and hardship as a prisoner of war. Nora and Francis make a comfortable life for themselves in Utah as they watch 40 years pass after the war. The war may have ended, but it certainly is not forgotten. It was recorded in the pages of history books and penned by many authors. One author, Adolf Galland, wrote extensively about his experience as a Luftwaffe pilot for the Nazis.
Adolf Galland was a very dynamic leader in the German Air Force. He had fought in Spain with the Legion Condor, had all kinds of combat experience against the Royal Air Force during the Battle of Britain. He had the tendency to annoy his superiors. When Reich Marshal Hermann Goering, the head of the Luftwaffe, asked if there was anything that he needed in his fight against the British during the Battle of Britain, he said, "Give me a squadron of British Spitfires." He was an ace, a very good leader and a good fighter pilot as well. Adolf Galland flew over 700 combat missions on most fronts.
Galland was a well-decorated soldier and leader.
Galland met Hitler when Hitler personally decorated him with the Knight's Cross. Adolf Galland went on to win further awards of the Knight's Cross. He won the Knight's Cross with oak leaf swords and diamonds, the highest award that you could receive from in the Luftwaffe as a fighter pilot. Not an avid Nazi backer, as some were, but I don't think they had much of a relationship, other than the fact that he was the leader of the German fighter arm and disagreed with some of the ideas of tactics of the higher ups in the German Luftwaffe.
The war was not only remembered in words, but also in image. Many painted the ravaged battlegrounds as well as the aviation planes in the air. Virginia Batter, a fine arts dealer originally from Devonshire, England, has dedicated much of her life promoting the works of aviation art. It was her work in aviation art that drew Adolf Golland and Virginia Batter together. Golland wanted a very specific painting of his last mission in Germany near the end of World War II and commissioned Virginia to have this painted. Virginia not only had the painting done, but went on to arrange promotional tours for Golland. This is how Virginia and Golland ended up in Salt Lake City on a promotional tour. It just so happens Francis lives nearby.
He was reading the paper one morning, and there was a small article about a German general who had written a book. Matter of fact, he had written a couple of books, and he was doing a book tour and was going to be in Salt Lake City. And he was a German general who was a fighter pilot, basically in the German armed forces. And my uncle's curiosity started to build, and he decided that he was going to go find out what this was all about. He went to the event at the bookstore to see what the book was about. I think my own personal opinion and what he expressed to me after this happened was that he just wanted to see if that side of the story from a German general was anywhere close to his side and what he seen that took place.
As Adolf Golland and Virginia Batter are setting up for the day, Francis is driving into Salt Lake City.
He had to park about a block away and find a parking place to park. And when he got there, he walked down the sidewalk, and in front of the bookstore, he walked past the front of the bookstore, and there was a painting there that the German general had commissioned to be painted according to his directions of what the title on the painting is I think it's My Last Battle. It's a painting of military Allied force aircraft and some German fighter planes, and of course the most prominent point on the picture is a German jet fighter right in the middle in the front, and that was the plane that the German general was flying. Well, I think the first thing that caught his attention was just the painting and the picture of the German fighter aircraft. But in the background of that picture, there is a B-26 bomber that is broke in half, that's been shot. And from what he told me, and I've looked at the picture numerous times, I don't know how he determined it, but there was something on that aircraft that was very familiar to him. My mother told me that she thought it was because he could see the aircraft tail number of that bomber. I can't see any numbers on it, but there was something there that Francis could see that made that aircraft very familiar to him.
Francis enters the building. He has no idea what to expect.
He had no idea who was in there. He knew from the description that was in the newspaper that it was General Gilliland, but he did not have any idea who he was, what his participation in the war was, and what that picture actually indicated, other than the fact that it showed a big blown up, oversized, big prominent part of it was the German jet fighter. Well, he walked in the bookstore and he stood in line for a little bit. There was some people in front of him, and he stood there and he watched, basically, I guess he just watched what was going on, and his biggest curiosities were what was in the painting and why it was there. So he walked up to the general, he introduced himself, and he asked the general, he said, in that painting that you have, there's some Allied aircraft that are in that painting, and one of them has been shot in two. And the German gentleman, who was General Gilliland, looked at him and he said, I shot that aircraft down. He said, that painting is a description of what took place that day from my end. He said, I attacked that aircraft. He said, I hit it. I said, I seen it come apart. And he said, I flew on to complete my mission. And that's when Francis described to him that he was on that plane.
Francis is now having a whole different encounter with the enemy, one that is face to face.
It was just kind of overwhelming and unreal. You know, it had been 40 years. Chances of it happening are extremely overwhelming, and this is one of those situations that the odds are unbelievably great that you would actually meet somebody or meet the man that actually shot down your aircraft and caused the culmination of the death of your flight partners.
This is a surreal moment for Francis, one that could turn out good or bad.
They talked quite a bit about life and their experiences and their war experiences. There was a lot of the conversation that went on that day that most of us, I would say none of us, are aware of what actually took place. But I'm sure it was a pretty in-depth conversation about what they had both been through and a little bit about the war and an understanding of what was going on and how they both ended up where they were at that point, 40 years later. He had a copy of the book, and he started to open up a little bit more. Francis and I were pretty good friends. We hunted together some, shot trap together. He was an expert trap shooter, had won numerous national amateur championships. We fished some together, but he never talked about the war, even though myself and my siblings and people in his family were aware of it. He never talked about it. We never asked questions. You know, we were kind of not really told not to ask questions, but we were just kind of guided not to inquire. So those things were not discussed until after that happened. After he met that gentleman at the bookstore, he started to open up a little bit more. Francis and the German general exchanged phone numbers, and they exchanged addresses, and they wrote some letters back and forth, and they talked on the telephone a few times. I really don't know what the context of those conversations or the letters was, but the German general at the time that this took place was actually living with his daughter in California. So he was in the United States. So they stayed in contact, not really frequently, but they stayed in contact quite a bit over the years until the German general left and went back to Germany.
Perhaps it was the miracle of surviving the plane shot down and being rescued from the hands of the enemy, or the peace in making it safely home to his wife Nora. But something about Francis was able to forgive General Golland, the man who shot down his plane.
It wasn't too long after that happened at the bookstore that him and I was sitting in the living room one day, and I asked him a question about what took place. And he told me that he met the guy that shot them down. Not a lot of explanation. He just told him that I met the guy that was flying the fighter plane that shot down my aircraft. And I asked him, I said, do you have any animosity? He said, nope. His exact words to me were, he was doing his job, and I was doing mine. And our lives just crossed at that time.